Hey, what's up? Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Coach's Compass. I'm Jabray, currently in Europe. My guy, Coach Coop, over in the States. Today, we're excited to have Derek Hansen with us. Before diving into his impressive coaching career, we'll like to highlight all our guests' athletic backgrounds, since his coaches are all washed-up athletes at heart. Derek competed in track at the high school, college, and national levels in Canada. Within his coaching career, Derek Hansen has been a well-renowned sports performance consultant and advisor, working with top organizations and elite athletes across professional sports. With over 30 years of coaching experience, his expertise spans sports speed development, running mechanics, return to play management, strategic program planning, electrical stimulation technologies. Derek has collaborated with major organizations like the NFL, NBA, NHL, MLB, MLS, NCAA, and Bundesliga, coaching and advising thousands of athletes at both professional and collegiate levels. I hope you didn't miss anything, Derek. How you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me, fellas.
How's
It's dope to have you here, man.
It's great. It's really great. I think I've been looking at your infographics on Instagram for like a long time now that have kind of just like sparked a lot of just like train of thought with my thought process that goes into speed. Just kind of like going reverse from when you started from after, I guess, competing at the track level for you and like getting out of grad school. What was that transition like out of being an athlete to coaching? Because I think Coop just finished retiring from American football over here in Europe. I'm still currently playing and coaching, and we're kind of transitioning into both going into, full-time coaching. Could you speak to that transition for you?
Yeah, I think I mean, at the time, you don't think it's something that maybe you'll like or be good at. And then it just naturally happens. Like, I think you make that transition from being the person who was taking orders to somebody who can offer advice now based on your experience. And it was a lot easier than I would have thought and a lot more enjoyable than I would have thought because you're like, well, I like the training, I like competing, but having some, guiding somebody else, I don't know if I'll like that or if I have the control or if it will be provide some sort of intrinsic value, and it did. So it was it was definitely a lot easier than I would have thought.
From there, like when you get into this coaching world, I think the hard part is, especially being a former athlete, is having that imposter syndrome. Do you ever, or have you ever had that imposter syndrome? And have you ever wondered, like, hey, am I doing the things right for my athletes and actually making them better?
You honestly, I have it more than ever before, right? Like it doesn't matter. Like 30 plus years of coaching, you question yourself more and more every day. So I think maybe that's what you need, though. Maybe I don't know. Maybe there's guys walking around thinking they know everything, but I'm the opposite. I'm like, wow, geez, because you always think you're only as good as your last coaching performance, right? And if that wasn't good, if for whatever reason, somebody like I look at the U.S. Olympic trials and the girl in the 800 who got tripped up and fell down, and you think, well, that's an accident. But I would think, like, as a coach, I'm like, I should have done something more to make sure that she wasn't put into that situation. Like, even though it was totally out of my control, like, that's how I think. Like, I think there's always something that could be done, and maybe I didn't turn over this rock or I didn't do this, but maybe that's what motivates me. So I think that's a good thing, even though it feels kind of nasty sometimes. I think it's a good thing to have in the back of your head, thinking we could do better, but not in a way that you undo some of the good things that you're doing. So I think you do have to have some recognition that you do have some talent and you have some ability, and you're not going to just change things completely when something goes wrong. You're going to go back and go like, oh, maybe it was this small little thing that I didn't do right, or this little thing that I didn't tell them. But I think it's that balance between like constantly thinking you're horrible, but at the same time you have sort of this calculating mind to know how to make the adjustments and keep moving forward. I think that's how I interpret it.
Yeah. I mean, like you look at the resume and the biography of everything that you've done, like over 20 years of experience of working with high level athletes, high level organizations. Now, if we talk about sprint mechanics and even working with, the youth level athletes, what are some things that you kind of see from the very beginning when you first get, those youth athletes or even an elite athlete in, that you kind of trying to fine tune and correct in their mechanics of sprinting?
I mean, at the very basic level, it's going to be really simple things like posture, what their head position is, how how they carry themselves, and I'll be honest, like you'll see somebody and you'll go, okay, that person has talent. You should be able to see what those qualities are, whether it's they're very reactive off the ground, or they can turn over quickly, or they just have a sense of power about them when they accelerate. But you're still going to fall back on, are they in the right position to apply force? Are they transitioning up to to an upright posture gradually? Do they have some sort of kinesthetic awareness around how to run fast? And then you're going in and you're just making these adjustments to how far their hand comes up, how their foot lands on the ground, and you're making those adjustments. But I would say I'm always starting from a postural model first, and just making sure they understand that when you accelerate, you just don't bend over at the waist, right? You have to have some sort of angled posture that drives you, and you get the horizontal components in, and then as you transition up it becomes more vertical. So I think I'm but the other side of that is I'm very patient. I don't have to correct everything in the first week or the first year, and that some of the stuff takes time. And I think I learned from Charlie Francis about that. He said some of his best athletes were horrible at things in the beginning, and then over time, through the process, things got rectified. So I think it's very tough. I think a lot of coaches want to fix everything right now because you have video of everything and you can analyze at high speed and slow motion. So things really stick out, and you're like, I got to fix that. And sometimes they don't have the strength, sometimes they don't have the general fitness, they don't have the awareness yet or coordination, and it's not possible to fix at this moment. But it could be eventually, once the qualities start coming together. So I think there's a patience involved with this coaching and fixing some of the mechanics as well.
With all the major organizations that you work with, from the NHL, the Bundesliga, MLS, NCAA, MLB, with all those sports kind of being so much different in what speed looks like for those sports, what does like your onboarding process or your assessment look like for, I guess, like your plan of attack for how you want to address the
Yeah.
speed capabilities for those
Good
sports?
question. I think a lot of the time, whenever I work with an organization, I want to see, video and film on them performing in their sport. I think that's where you start. And then you can draw some conclusions around, okay, what is unique about that sport that may change the mechanics a bit? So ice hockey, obviously, there's a difference in terms of pushing out to the side at higher velocities. Basketball might be different just because of the size of the court, and nobody has room to accelerate as much. American football, each position is a little different. So I think you have to observe the baseball. Like we did this analysis with a couple of baseball teams that I work with, and I noticed that a lot of players were overstriding and reaching right off of first base after they get a hit. And so I'm like, oh, that's strange. Like, look, they're not staying over their feet. They're kind of reaching a bit. And I think that's because they're thinking, I got to put my foot on that first base bag. So they're constantly thinking, I got to get to the bag, because the contact on the bag is going to determine whether they're out or safe, right? As opposed to, their chest, or, tagging somebody or tackling somebody. So just understanding that that's the mindset in that sport makes you maybe change how you approach it when you start working with the athletes. And you don't overcorrect it because maybe they're so used to doing that. And I think it's very easy to come in with a track and field perspective and say, everybody has to run like Usain Bolt, or everybody has to look like a track athlete. And that's not the case. Like I have running backs that I work with, and you want them to learn how to run tall like a sprinter for, getting a good 40 time. But when they play, if they're running tall, they're going to get killed, right? They can't change direction as easily. If somebody hits them, they'll go flying. So I think you have to have an idea of what's required in the sport before you can make meaningful and useful changes when you start working with them. And maybe you speak their language a bit more, and maybe you let some things go that you wouldn't if you're working with a 100-meter sprinter, a world-class 100-meter sprinter. So I think that's why you have to have that experience sometimes of working with different sports, and talking to those coaches and find out what they're trying to achieve with their athletes. And some of it may be counter to what you're telling them, but finding some sort of common ground where you can kind of both coach them effectively.
When you're trying to find that common ground though, like what are, like, even if we talk about just the sprint mechanics, like if you talk about just the acceleration phase, what are some cues that you're using to kind of get the athletes to understand, because every athlete has a different way of learning and a different way of like responding to things. How do you get it to come across for all of them to kind of understand what you're trying to say? Because obviously you have a lot of knowledge, a lot of science behind everything that you're doing. What I want to try to understand is, like, with these different athletes that you're working with, is like, how do you get them to understand what you're trying to get across to them?
Again, very good question. I mean, it's you everything is a subset of one. So you can always say like, well, this worked with this guy over here. And if you just go in and say like we're going to do that with this person, I think a lot of the time you're going to run into roadblocks. So you have to, I mean, it's like improv, right? Like you have to work on your feet and just say, okay, let's just get you to do a marching A, or like I do fall back on the drills a lot to kind of calibrate my brain around what they're going to look like and how they respond to cues. And it's a good way to do it because very rarely is somebody going to get hurt doing a drill, a march, a skip, a running A. So I usually start with that, and I'm observing. I'm observing one, how they move, how they respond to my cues, but also I'm observing like how are they accepting me, in terms of like our relationship, and are you listening? Do they pay attention? Are they just kind of going through the motions? And I think that's really important. Like it does come down to how you relate with people, if that's going to be a successful relationship and we're going to take it, to a long-term relationship. Because if that doesn't work, like if it doesn't matter how smart I am, and if I'm not connecting with that athlete or the coaches that are working with that athlete, it's not going to go very far. So I think I'm hyper aware of those types of scenarios first, and then, take them through the drills and see how they respond. And you may find that they don't like the drills, like, or they don't respond to the drills, or they just sort of think it's useless. And then you might get them to do some submaximal accelerations or from different start positions. And you have to find what does work with that athlete. And it might be just going straight into the running and just skipping the drills, because I've had very talented athletes who just aren't good at the drills. But when they run, they look so smooth, relaxed, and efficient. And maybe because the drills tend to be more sort of forebrain, like cognitive, they work better when they're not thinking about stuff, right? They're just autonomic, masters. So I think you're always navigating all these. And again, it does come back to like you have a database of people you've worked with, and you can pull from this person. Okay, that worked with that person. So I'm going to try it with this guy now, or this girl. And you're like, okay, that worked. That's the combination that works. So it is putting together a bit of a puzzle at the beginning. And then as you start understanding their tendencies and how they respond to you, then the momentum picks up. And I would say that's no different. Honestly, that's no different in teaching somebody how to sprint than working with a new client. So like I've worked with actors too. And sometimes you work with an actor and you have to figure out, because they're not necessarily great athletes, let's be honest. So it doesn't matter how smart you are, you still have to connect with that actor and make them enjoy what they're doing with you. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. They'll just take off and hire somebody else if they don't feel comfortable with you. So I think it's good to coach other people for that reason, other athletes, other people, like general population, because you're going to learn something from those interactions that's going to help you when you have to work with the fastest man or woman in the world, or the best wide receiver or best quarterback. So I'm very open to learning from those environments too.
Yeah, and we go back to like when you talked about earlier about so many coaches like wanting that, now feedback, or wanting to correct things right away. Like when you get an athlete, or even if you get an actor, because you have the video, you have all this technology and stuff. How have you used technology for yourself to help your athletes and your general population? But how have you seen, technology also hurt training? You know what I mean? Because like if you look at videos like all the time, like all you're doing is going
Yep.
back and looking at video feedback instead of sometimes like remembering that the coach's eye sometimes is a lot better than the video, and like sometimes that also kind of sometimes will waste time. You know what I mean? Like, why
Yeah.
are we recording everything? Why do we need to use so many different, resistance training things? All these different types of equipment that are out there now.
Yeah.
How have you used them, and how have you seen them kind of mess with the training space now?
A very good question. You know what I keep going back to is how many people actually use a stopwatch now? Not very many, right? Because they think it's inferior technology. Like, well, you're not going to start it at the right time or stop it. But when I was coming up, even like the analog stopwatches, like tick 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 tick, people were using those, and reliably coaching their athletes and getting an assessment of where they are. And so, Charlie Francis, again, he would time a certain way so that he made sure he didn't start the timer until he saw the rear foot leave the ground on a start. And then, his times were a little faster, but that's how he always timed. So he knew somebody was faster based on the way he timed. So he had calibrated it a certain way, and he didn't, did he need timing gates or anything else, or lasers or whatever? No, because he was very confident in the way he was evaluating his athletes. So, but now that we get into this technology ridden society or field, there's so many things that can interrupt your coaching flow and the workflow that actually is very useful. And again, the communication, the recovery, and making sure you're not interrupting things. But now it's like, and I've worked with teams in the NFL where they have to put the vests on and the GPS, and players grabbing the puck and throwing it into the stadium stands and saying, I don't want to wear this. So the technology can be very what's the word, like just invasive. So it kind of ruins the vibe, right? So I think you have to be very careful of how frequently you use this stuff. And periodically you can have a testing battery that you do and you test people. But I think the quicker you get away from that and you just get back into the training flow, I think the more valuable and useful your time is, right? So, or it's non-invasive. Maybe video is less invasive, and then you just refer to it once in a while. But you're not stopping everybody during the workout and saying, okay, let's look at your run. It just bogs everything down. And there's something to be said for the athlete to have that awareness. If you say like, hey, I want you to bring your head up more gradually, and then they respond to it rather than them seeing it. Because that, again, if you're in the heat of battle and you're at a competition and you want to just yell something out to them like adjust this, they might be more aware of how to do that if you haven't had video and sensors on them and all this stuff. So I'm trying to balance that. Like I love technology, but I think sometimes maybe the technology is you kind of keep it to yourself and you kind of look as a coach, but you don't necessarily show the athlete or broadcast it to everyone else because it will be disruptive on many occasions. That's at least my thought.
I know you're pretty big in like the technology. I've seen that on the Simply Faster. With regards to all the technology and I guess maybe timing or metrics that you use, what does your data monitoring look like, and how do you go about using that to make decisions in the future or on the day or weekly?
Yeah, I think you have to take a longitudinal approach as well, because it's so easy to like, and we've all had it. You go to a training session and you're timing something and the numbers just don't look good, right? I see, because I have a track and field background, I see this a lot where if you go to a certain competition and the temperature's down or the wind's hitting them a certain way, or just even the humidity is different, it does affect performance. And it's very easy to go to a meet and go, we ran horribly, I have to change the training program. But some of it is very circumstantial to that particular day. And so the same goes in training, where if you do a testing session with somebody and the numbers come back poorer than you thought, well, do you overreact to that result, or do you kind of, put it in the back of your head and go, okay, well, contextually, maybe we pushed them too hard on the 2 days out, and I'm going to take this result with a grain of salt. Or it was 10 degrees colder, which does make a difference. I don't think people realize that the temperature has a huge difference on maximal outputs for speed. So I think you have to collect that data over a long period of time, see the patterns, see at the time of year, like this is what we'll normally expect in April versus June. And I really think you have to take that broad view, because if you're just reacting every time a result comes up, it's going to drive you nuts. You're going to be totally anxious all the time, and you're going to think I'm doing things wrong. And then sometimes it'll be really good and you'll have no explanation for it. Right. And that happens where somebody does something amazing. Like I was looking at Bob Beeman's long jump record, and it was 29 feet, 2.5 or something like that. So that's 890. Do you know what his other jumps were in that competition? No, they were like 3 feet shorter, and he only had 2 other attempts. Or it was like not even close. So he hit it on the one jump, and then I don't even think he came close to that ever again. And it was just, and so I don't know why did that happen? Like, did he just nail it on that jump? Was the wind just right? Or, all these things. So sometimes stuff happens, and just because you get a result doesn't mean that's the status of the athlete. That's the whole thing between preparedness and readiness. Like, you have to understand that, like, they are where they should be, but they had a bad day. Right. So, as opposed to watching like a presidential debate and then comparing that against all of his appearances, right? And you're like, okay, this dude's not sharp. Like, it's not just the debate, it's everything. So
Yeah.
I think longitudinally we can make that
But like, even so, like, if you look back into your coaching career and like you look at, I mean, again, we talk about so many years in the game, but like, why such a, and I know you have a track background, but why such a focus on speed development and then return to play? Like, what got you so interested and excited about it? Like, this is going to be my area of expertise, and this is what I'm going to go down.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I thought that, like, I ended up doing a lot of long jump, triple jump, and I didn't, for a period of time, I stopped just racing and running. And then when I did a couple of runs, I'm like, oh, okay, that was pretty good. I wonder what it would have been like if I actually trained to be a sprinter. And so I think there's like an emptiness or a void where you're like, wow, I want to learn more about that, because I definitely didn't do it right as an athlete. And I might have neglected that. So I think that was part of it. And then the return to play stuff started to become an issue, because if you work with sprinters all the time, there's always going to be something popping up, right? Like, the faster you run, the more exposed you are, the riskier it becomes. So you better know how to resolve those issues if you're going to be working with people who move fast. Whereas if you're working with long distance runners or swimmers, they tend to be more overuse injuries as opposed to acute injuries. So I think that's how I got drawn into it, is, and again, the people that taught me were very smart about the rehab too. And I think it just becomes a self-sufficiency thing where you're like, okay, this is part of the deal. I can't just be a sprint coach or a speed coach and not understand how to address hamstring injuries or hip flexors or, all of these things. And then once you get that methodology down, you find that a lot of the same methodology applies to different injuries, because it's just progressive overload anyways. It's not rocket science. It's like, okay, well, let's bring them back gradually and in a way that allows them to keep moving and improve every day. So I think if you're a good coach, you probably have a good sense of the rehab, because it's just a different version of coaching.
With
On
regards
top
to
of
all of
that,
that, how has your philosophy changed from, I guess, now to when you started? More so like with regards to speed. I guess, like, for example, with me, is just like I've been very dogmatic, and I think that comes from just like my influences of coaches before, more so coming from American football and like the
Yep.
meathead area. So my my idea and philosophies on speed was more so strength driven, and kind of my philosophy on that has kind of changed now. What have your been
Yep.
what have been your early philosophies on speed, and what it's transitioned to as of late?
I think as, and it's just probably the same for me as it is for others, is when you first start getting into like working with sprinters, is, you have kind of a broad program, and then you want to try to get more specific. So like, you're like, okay, well, how can we do more stuff on the track, and how can we, get more competitions in? But after going through that and then, like you were saying, I think a lot of people now have gotten into, well, the only way we can improve acceleration is we have to add resistance to it, because that's more specific, right? Rather than just doing a good weight program and then letting it transfer. I think people want to pull sleds or push sleds or whatever, book cable, and they think that's better. But the more that you start peeling the layers away, you start to understand that no, we have to have a good comprehensive program. They have to be fit. There has to be some aerobic work in there to make sure that they recover faster, and they're just more well-rounded, in terms of their fitness. And the weight room is valuable, because if all we're doing is pushing and pulling sleds, that puts a lot of stress on the Achilles, the calf, the foot, and we're relying on putting in more volume with resistance on top of the running volume we have to do already. I think I've gone from like general to specific, and now I'm going back to a little more general. And I understand from a health point of view that we have to have well-rounded athletes in order to pile on some of the volumes that we need to get them better. And I think a lot of people are getting away from running volume. I think they're looking to gym solutions or resisted solutions, and going back to some of the stuff that I learned in the 70s and 80s, which tend to be more general fitness, GPP related early on, and getting people strong and healthy and fit, and then starting to narrow things down as we got into competitive phases. But what you're finding now is that all of these preparatory windows are shrinking. And so people are like, well, I can't do 6 to 10 weeks of GPP. I can only just start training specifically right away, which in the short term might be good, but in the long term, I think we're going to keep seeing more soft tissue injuries, more joint injuries, more ACLs, more Achilles in professional sport at younger ages. Remember when Achilles were like, oh, that guy's 35. I get it. That's why he burst his Achilles. Now it's 22, 23, 21. In the NFL, I think the largest number was 23-year-olds.
I
So
think that was you
something
that
happened.
posted about the COVID after COVID.
Yeah. Yeah, and since COVID, it hasn't really improved. It's gotten worse. So, have we gotten away from things that we were previously good at, or are we rushing things too much? So, and then there's always questions about COVID and vaccines and all that, and I don't know. That's not my area, but certainly something has changed, and I think we have to, as practitioners, we have to kind of take this into consideration in how we prepare our athletes.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about some of and obviously we saw you at Sportsmith, right? You went there and you spoke there, and you're obviously a highly renowned coach. Who are some of the coaches that you're learning from, like yourself, or some of the guys that you kind of really respect in this game, not only in just like the speed sense, but in the sports performance, strength and conditioning world that you are looking at and like seeing what they're doing and taking bits and pieces from them and continuously expanding on your knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, most of my mentors originally were old school people, like from the 70s, 80s, and I drew from them. So whether it's Al Vermeil learning some on the strength side, or Charlie Francis learning on the sprint side, and following people like John Smith, who was a track coach in California, looking at stuff that Dan Paff did, and so that's kind of the older generation. Now that we're getting into sort of more current people, you will notice that there is more of a technology emphasis for all of these people. So I think that's what I'm drawing on, is I'm carefully looking at what people are doing with technology and trying to get a sense of whether or not this is useful or this is good, or where the shortfalls are. There's other people that I lean on in different areas, whether it's rehab, like my good friend Rob Panarello, who did some work in the NFL recently, and just asking him, like, what do you think has changed? What are we doing well? What have we forgotten? Because I think that's a really important thing, is maybe there's some good things, and I'll go back to my old training journals and just look and see what I did and what I thought worked, and then I'm like, well, I got away from that, right? So I think there has to be this combination of looking forward but also looking back, and trying to piece it all together. One of the guys I talk to frequently is Andrew Hauser, who was a rehab expert in Major League Baseball for the Dodgers and the Braves. And so he works privately in Arizona now, and he's really big on this idea that we have to get people aerobically fit, and maybe that's a missing piece because it affects local blood supply and muscle oxygenation. So he uses like Moxie monitors as part of injury rehab to see where people are deficient. And he's finding that a lot of the pro athletes that he's working with are lacking those general fitness qualities, and maybe they can throw a fastball really hard, or they can hit a whole bunch of home runs, or they can run a fast 40, but they're deficient in other areas that are hampering their health and their resiliency. So I think, I know what I know, so I'm trying to see where I can shore up my knowledge base with people who are experts in other areas, and who have very specific niches. But I think you have to do that. You have to constantly ask around, And sometimes you'll go to a conference and you'll see what people are presenting, and you talk to people and you go, okay. And you put that in the back of your mind and you kind of refer to it. I think, again, it goes back to your initial question about, this imposter syndrome thing where you have to question yourself and you have to constantly look at what you're doing and what your results are, and then there's going to be some failures still in there, and okay, well, how can I shore that up? Well, I'll ask this person, or I'll ask that person, or maybe I'll check this type of research out and try this new technology. But I think you have to be a little anxious, you have to be a little insecure, and that's going to drive your behavior to get better.
I don't know if
How
you saw the
hard?
most recent podcast with Gadango, and he had Will Rattel on there, and they're discussing Will Rattel was discussing some of the athletes that he has that run 9 or 8 or faster, and I think I forgot his name. He was questioning why exercises like power cleans or heavy squats or like I guess gym based exercises don't have an effect on these athletes with regards to transfer of training. And obviously, with you with your track background, I wanted to hear what you had to say about that because that's still kind of new for me, especially working with American football, because just like the gym always has to be present there, and
Yeah.
it is kind of crazy to know that the gym to a certain extent, especially working with these athletes that are running under 10 or 9.8, has like the work that you do there is just too slow.
Yeah, I mean, when people ask me, like when I prepare programs and we start talking about the strength training piece, usually I want something in there, right? Like, are you doing something? And it doesn't have to be overly specific. If you are great at Olympic lifting, maybe we access that, but we don't try to draw too much from it. Like we're trying to get a different stimulus in there, from a recruitment point of view and just general central nervous system stress, but you're not trying to pull from that too much because that energy is going to take away from your sprint requirements. And I learned that the hard way. We had some athletes, and this was like probably about 20 years ago, where because I had a lot of Olympic lifting influence behind me at the time, they got really good at Olympic lifting, but we found that they kind of stalled when it came to their getting better at their 100 and their 200. And so we had to back off because they had the fiber type to be good Olympic lifters, but I was robbing them, of that energy. So I think, and then if you ever watch like a top sprinter do power cleans, it usually looks pretty horrible. Um, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that you don't need to push in that direction as much. Like it could be, I think Charlie Francis had Ben Johnson doing bench squats and bench press, so nothing crazy, but he did hit some high loads. But is that more a representation of his fiber type and his ability, rather than saying that, oh, he ran fast because he squatted a lot? So I think we have to be very careful. And you remember the old discussions about like the Olympic lifters used to be faster to 10 meters than the sprinters, and that has nothing to do with Olympic lifting. It has to do with, like, at the time, a lot of Soviet athletes and Eastern Bloc athletes were pushed into Olympic lifting, and they were probably very fast twitch oriented because that worked in Olympic lifting, especially if they had short limbs. And so the short limb fast twitch guys probably get out to 10 really well, right? But when they get out to 60, they can't move as well because they don't have the limb length, and they're just not the same, right? So I think, rather than saying Olympic lifting made them fast sprinters, you have to kind of pull the curtains back a bit and go, okay, well, they were good Olympic lifters because they had good muscle fiber and good nervous system, and that lent itself to running fast over 10 meters. So I think you really have to peel back the layers and really kind of understand what's going on before you make these conclusions that, yes, this type of lifting is best for sprinting, and then people are going getting into isometrics now, but you don't want that pendulum to swing too far where everybody's doing isometrics for sprinting. Like, there's a very, very specific case situation for that. So again, you have to have a good knowledge base and experience to be able to pull and say, okay, this exercise works here, it doesn't work here, or maybe it's in a certain phase of your development, or your training program where you're doing a little bit of heavy lifting and then you get away from it, right? So it's very circumstantial, and it'll be based on the athlete in front of you and what they do well with. And if they don't know how to power clean, well, maybe you do something else. Maybe you do a deadlift or a trap bar deadlift, or maybe you're more plyo based. Maybe they respond better to plyometrics. Everybody's going to be different. And in every training group that we look at, there's always one really good sprinter, and then there's everybody else. It's very rarely that everybody on that training group is doing well. There's always one that does really well, and then there's a few that don't do quite as well. So maybe they're responding to that training program, but the other people aren't quite responding unless you start to individualize more, which is very hard to do, as we know. So I think it's fascinating, but I think you do have to start peeling away the layers and really getting into the weeds of understanding what makes somebody faster, and it may not apply to
knowing what you know now, like after all these years in the coaching athletes and general population, and also being an athlete yourself, what would you tell 16-year-old Derek?
I don't know, because like I have kids, right? And I'm trying to tell them stuff. They don't listen to me. So I don't know if I would listen to me, right? So I don't know. I think I would go back on this whole multi-sport thing. Like, I played soccer, basketball, track, and I did I did a lot of different sports, and I think that was really helpful. And I think it's so easy to get caught up and to be driven into specifics, because if you become a specialized person really early, you will have success. We know that, right? But is it better for your long-term development? Did it push Tiger Woods into having, a nervous breakdown at some point because that's all he did and he put everything into that? I don't know. But certainly I always think about stuff like that and how I would have done things differently. I think the only thing I would have done differently was probably spend a little more time on just continuing to do basic linear speed and acceleration, and carving out some time to do, and just making sure it's continuous. So like if I started, it's like investing, right? Like if you put away $1,000 a year when you were young and you do that consistently every month, the compound interest is incredible. What can happen, right? I heard that thing about the iPhone where instead of buying every iPhone, you just took the money and you invested into Apple, you'd have $1 million by now. I think it's kind of the same with training, where you have to keep investing, and there's like a compound adaptation that happens over time. If you keep doing the right things consistently, it will pay off later. So I think that's something that probably I would tell myself is like, just keep doing these basic things, and you're going to be fine as long as you're consistent with it.
Yeah. Tell 16-year-old Derek to invest everything he has in Apple.
In Apple and Microsoft, yeah, absolutely.
Early
This will
on.
be our first time doing this, but can you leave like a closing question for our next guest?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I would say, how are you trying to make yourself better on a daily basis? Like it's really tough. Like, and especially as you get older, because you lose energy. I want to try to stay motivated as possible, and obviously talking to people like yourselves helps because it makes me think. So I think, what are you doing, either yourself or you getting somebody to help you, to make sure that you're getting better as you get older? And you're not overlooking things, you're not taking stuff for granted. And I think that happens very easily, where if you have success, you start to miss things, or you start to overlook things, or you start to not do the things that got you there, right? Like if you watch like I remember watching as a kid, was it Rocky 3, where Mr. T was in that one? And Rocky's like getting pulled away from training, and he's doing all his Hollywood stuff, and Mr. T kicks his ass, right? And then you see, like, that's what happened to Mike Tyson, and that's what happens to everybody, right? At some point, you to get to that point, you're hungry, or you got that drive, and then you get there, and wherever that may be, and you just kind of lose it. So I think, what are you doing, even if you have success? What are you doing to stay sharp? That's what I would like to know.
Well, we'll send that to you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Mr. T.
But before we get out of here, we got our last segment of the day. We got our 60-second round, right? It's 10
Okay.
questions, one word answers. Are you ready for it?
Yes.
All right, here we go. 60 seconds on the clock. Favorite post-workout snack?
Oh, something with peanut butter.
Favorite sport?
I was gonna say football, as like watching football, because every game counts. So we'll say that.
Dream vacation spot.
Dream vacation spot. I'm gonna say Iceland.
Guilty pleasure food.
Guilty pleasure food. I'm gonna say something with peanut butter.
Best concert you've been to.
Best concert, Prince. Prince concert in like
Wow.
1989. Yeah, where it's circular. It was a circular stage and it kept rotating. And yeah, Prince concert. Yeah.
Favorite movie genre.
Movie genre. That's a good question. It's gonna be sort of like I'm actually more towards like documentary type now.
Dream car.
We have an original 65 Mustang that my father bought when he was young. We still have it, but I'm going to say a 69 El Camino.
Best gym you've ever been to.
Best gym? Oh, it's got to be my buddy's gym that is no longer there, but it was Drive Gym on Broadway in Soho in New York City. Yeah, so Don Saladino's gym, but unfortunately it's not there anymore.
And last one, would you rather be in the octagon with a gorilla, tiger, or a bear?
Whatever would finish me the fastest, I guess. The gorilla, I think, would rip you apart. So I'm going to say that at least the bear would knock your head off. Probably, I don't know. Yeah, whatever would finish me the quickest. Like,
all of them suck, and that is
yeah,
it.
That's not a good question.
Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate you taking the time out.
Awesome,
man.
guys. Thanks for waiting on me, and thank you for taking the time and thinking of me.
Of
No
course,
worries.
we're out of here.